I'm calling 911 right now to have you arrested for trespassing. That's what this HOA. Karen screamed at me when I refused to leave my own lakeside cabin. Victoria was absolutely convinced. She had the law on her side, waving her clipboard like some kind of legal weapon, demanding I pack up and get out of community property. When I calmly said no, I'm staying right here, she completely lost her mind and actually dialed the police. She was so sure she was about to watch me get dragged away in handcuffs. This woman thought she was dealing with some random guy living in an old cabin. She had absolutely no idea she was about to make the biggest mistake of her whole career. Comment below if you think this. Karen is about to learn a hard lesson. It's a perfect Saturday morning at Pine Lake. The mist is still rising off the water, birds are chirping, and I'm sitting on my little dock with my grandfather's golden bamboo fishing rod, just enjoying the peace. This cabin has been in my family since 1987, and honestly, there's nowhere I'd rather be. The water's like glass, reflecting the pine trees that give this place its name, and I've got my tackle box beside me with all my gear neatly organized. Life doesn't get much better than this. I'm thinking about maybe catching some bass for dinner, when suddenly I hear the aggressive clip-clop of heels marching down my gravel path. That's when I first laid eyes on Victoria, though I didn't know her name yet. She came stomping toward me like she owned the place, clutching this bright red clipboard like it was some kind of weapon. She's probably in her mid-50s, with that particular Karen haircut, the one, and she's wearing this blazer that screams, "I want to speak to your manager." The look on her face told me everything I needed to know. This woman was on a mission, and I was apparently the target. She didn't even bother with pleasantries, just marched right up to the edge of my dock and started talking like she was reading from some official document. "Excuse me, sir," she announced in this incredibly condensed tone. "According to whole resolution 15B, this lakefront area is designated for community use only. You need to remove your belongings and vacate immediately." She held up that clipboard like she was serving me with legal papers or something. I almost laughed out loud, but I kept my cool. I have learned over the years that staying calm in situations like this usually works out better for everyone involved. "I appreciate your concern," I told her with a polite smile, "but I'm staying right here." That seemed to catch her off guard for a second, like she wasn't expecting any pushback, but Victoria wasn't the type to back down easily. Her face started turning red, and she puffed herself up like some kind of angry bird. "We'll see about that," she declared, waving the clipboard around. "I have the authority to enforce HOA regulations, and I've done my homework. Every single property around this lake falls under HOA jurisdiction. You're trespassing on community property, and if you don't leave voluntarily, I'll have you removed by force." The whole time she's talking, I'm glancing over at this sealed envelope sitting on top of my tackle box. It's marked Pine Lake Important in my grandfather's handwriting, and suddenly it feels a lot more relevant than it did 5 minutes ago. Just then old Pete walks by on his morning constitutional. Pete's been living around here for 35 years, back when this was just a sleepy little community. Before all the development started, he's seen it all, and nothing much phases him anymore. As he passes behind Victoria, he catches my eye and whispers just loud enough for me to hear. She's barking up the wrong tree. Saw Victoria spins around, but Pete just keeps walking like nothing happened, whistling some old tune. You got to love the guy. He's got more spine than most people half his age. Victoria glares at him for a second, then turns back to me with this triumphant look on her face. "See, even your neighbors know you don't belong here," she said confidently. During the situation, I could see Pete shaking his head as he walked away, probably thinking about all that Victoria's he's dealt with over the years. She continued her rant. "I've spent weeks researching the property records. The HOA law is everything. This entire lakefront belongs to the Homeowners Association, and as the newly elected president, it's my responsibility to ensure these regulations are enforced. You can't just set up camp wherever you feel like and pretend you own the place." The irony of that statement wasn't lost on me, but I figured I'd let her finish her speech before responding. I stood up slowly, carefully setting my fishing rod aside, and looked Victoria straight in the eye. "There's something about staying calm when someone's yelling at you that really throws them off their game," Mammy said in my most respectful voice. "I understand you believe you're doing your job, but I think there might be some information you're missing. This cabin has been in my family for decades, and I have every right to be here." She started to interrupt, but I held up my hand. "However, since you seem so confident in your research, perhaps we should take a closer look at those property records you mentioned." That's when I picked up that sealed envelope from my tackle box and tucked it into my jacket pocket. Victoria watched me put away my fishing gear with a smug expression, probably thinking she'd won some kind of victory. "Finally coming to your senses," she muttered under her breath, but as I walked past her toward my cabin, I noticed something that made me pause. There, almost hidden in the weeds north shoreline, was an old property boundary marker, one of those metal posts with numbers on it that surveyors Use of numbers were partially obscured by years of overgrowth, but they were still there. I made a mental note to take a closer look at that marker later. After I dealt with my unexpected visitor, don't think this is over. Victoria called after me as I headed up the path. I'll be back with proper documentation. And next time, you won't have a choice in the matter. I turned around and gave her one last polite nod. Have a good day, ma'am, I said, and I meant it after. A Leverioni deserves to have a good day, even if they're about to have their world turned upside down. Now, as I watched her stomp back up the path, still clutching that red clipboard, I couldn't help but wonder just how thorough her research really was. But what if Victoria's research wasn't as thorough as she thought? Drop a comment. If you've ever dealt with an overzealous HOA president, well, Victoria wasn't kidding when she said she'd be back 2 days later. I'm out on my dock again, same spot, same fishing rod, just enjoying another peaceful morning when I hear a car door slam up by the road. This time she's got backup, not people, but paperwork. She comes marching down with this enormous folder and what looks like official notices printed on fancy letterhead. I told you I'd be back, she announces. Like she's some kind of sheriff serving a warrant, she slapped this paper down on my tackle box, hard enough to make my coffee mug jump to $0 fine for violation of community standards plus a 24-hour notice to vacate the premises. I picked up the notice and gave it a quick read. It was impressive, I'll give her that, all very official, looking with references to specific HOA bylaws and regulations. But here's the thing about paperwork, it's only as good as the authority behind it. This is quite elaborate, I told her, setting the paper aside. I can see you put a lot of work into this. That seemed to please her for about half a second until I continued. I've decided to have my attorney take a look at the situation, so I'll be sending him a certified letter outlining our discussion. The look on her face when I mentioned having a lawyer was priceless, like she'd just been slapped with a cold fish. Legal intimidation tactics, she practically shrieked. I should have known. You try to lawyer your way out of this, well, to can play the game, buddy. I know people too, and I'm not going to be bullied by some squatter who thinks he can intimidate the rightful property owner. She was getting more worked up by the minute, pacing back and forth on my dock like some kind of caged animal. I kept fishing, which seemed to annoy her even more. There's something about maintaining your routine when someone's trying to disrupt your life. The real is under their skin. You think you're so clever, she continued, but I've got news for you. This is still America, and we have laws here. That's when things took a turn for the truly ridiculous. Victory pulled out her phone and started dialing, making sure I could see exactly what she was doing. Yes, I need police, she said in this overly dramatic voice. I have a trespasser on community property who's refusing to leave and is now threatening legal action against the homeowners association. She gave them my address, well, what she thought was my address, and made it sound like I was some kind of dangerous criminal holed up in a bunker the whole time. She's talking to the dispatcher. She's staring at me like she's watching a cornered rat, probably expecting me to panic and pack up my stuff. About 15 minutes later, I hear sirens coming down the lake road. 2 patrol cars pull up, and I can see Victoria practically bouncing on her toes with excitement. She rushes up to me, the officers pointing dramatically in my direction. That's him, that's the trespasser. He has been illegally occupying our community lakefront for weeks. The cops, to young officers who look like they'd rather be anywhere else, walk down to my dock with Victoria trailing behind them, still clutching the red clipboard like it's going to somehow validate her entire existence. Good morning, officers, I said, not bothering to reel in. A beautiful day for fishing, isn't it? One of them, a tall guy with a mustache, nodded politely. Sir, we've received a complaint about trespassing. Do you mind if we ask you a few questions? I gestured to the bench beside me. Not at all. Would you like to sit down? Victoria looked like she was about to explode. Don't offer them seats. This isn't a socialcal. I want him arrested for trespassing on homeowners association property. The officers exchanged one of those looks that cops give each other when they realize they're dealing with a difficult complainant. The second officer, a shorter woman with sergeant stripes, opened her notepad. Ma'am, we'll handle this, sir. Can you tell us your connection to this property? That's when I reached into my tackle box and pulled out that sealed envelope. I'd been saving. Certainly, officer, I think this will explain everything. I broke the seal carefully. It had been sitting there for 3 years since my grandfather passed, waiting for the right moment. Inside was the original property deed from 1987, along with a handwritten note from my grandfather explaining the special covenant that came with the land. This lakefront parcel remains exempt from all future homeowner association agreements. I read aloud from the legal document that property was grandfathered, and when the HOA was established, and the owner retains all riparian rights and exclusive use of the shoreline extending 50 feet in either direction from the cabin. I handed the deed to the sergeant, who studied it carefully while Victoria stood there with her mouth hanging open like she was trying to catch flight. The officer walked over to the old boundary marker I'd noticed earlier, brushed away the weeds, and confirmed the property numbers matched the deed exactly, ma'am, the sergeant said, turning to Victoria with a professional but firm tone. This gentleman owns this property outright. These documents are legitimate and properly recorded. You filed a false police report. Victoria's face went through about 6 different shades of red before settling on something that looked like she'd been stung by a whole nest of hornets. That's impossible, she sputtered. I researched everything. The HOA has jurisdiction over the entire lakefront. The mustache officer shook his head. I'm sorry, Mom, but the law is pretty clear on this. Grandfathered properties retain their original rights, regardless of subsequent HOA formation. Sergeant handed me back my deed and gave Victoria a look that could have frozen the lake in July. Ma'am, filing false reports is a serious matter. We're not going to charge you this time, but I strongly suggest you verify your facts before involving law enforcement in civil disputes. Victoria looked like she wanted to argue, but even she wasn't stupid enough to keep fighting with the police when they'd already made their position clear. As the officers walked back to their cars, I called out to them, thank you for your professionalism, officers. I hope the rest of your shift is quieter than this. Victoria stood there for a long moment after the police left, just staring at me like she was trying to figure out how her perfect plan had gone so wrong. Finally, she found her voice. This isn't over, she said. Butyl, the fight had gone out of her tone. She sounded more confused than angry now, like someone had just told her the sky was actually green. Maybe next time you'll check property records more carefully, I suggested, casting my line back into the water. She turned and walked away without another word, but I could practically see the gears turning in her head. What lengths will Victoria go to now that her first plan backfired spectacularly? Tell me about the worst Karen encounter you've witnessed. If I thought Victoria would slink away quietly after her humiliation with the police, I was dead wrong. Over the next week, I started noticing some weird stuff happening around my property. At first, it was small things. My fishing lines would be cut. When I left them overnight, there'd be soap suds in the water near me, dock, and someone kept moving my garbage cans around. I knew it was her, but proving it was another matter entirely. Victoria had apparently decided that if she couldn't get me evicted through official channels, she'd make my life miserable enough that I'd want to leave on my own. What she didn't realize was that I'd been dealing with difficult people a lot longer than she'd been perfecting her Karen. The real campaign started when she went digital. I found out later that she created this online group called Concerned Pine Lake Residents and was spreading all kinds of wild stories about me. According to Victoria's version of events, I was some kind of dangerous loner who was threatening the safety of the entire community. She posted photos of my cabin from weird angles to make it look run down and menacing, and she even made up stories about loud music and wild parties that literally never happened. The woman had a real talent for creative writing. I'll give her that. She was telling people I was some kind of environmental hazard who was polluting the lake and driving down property values. What really got under my skin was when she started impersonating other people online. She created fake accounts pretending to be longtime residents who are concerned about the new squatter situation. One of them was supposedly old Pete, which was hilarious because Pete couldn't operate a computer if his life depended on it. But the fake Pete was posting all kinds of worried comments about how the young man by the lake was making everyone uncomfortable. When the real Pete found out about this, he came storming over to my place. Madder than I had ever seen him. The woman's got some nerve, he growled, shaking his head, hissing my name to spread her poison. What's she going to try next? The harassment escalated pretty quickly after that. Someone started parking cars in front of my driveway, always different vehicles, always with some excuse about why they had to block my access. My mailbox got accidentally knocked over twice in 1 week. Someone scattered garbage around my property and then complained to the county about my poor maintenance. It was like being attacked by mosquitoes individually. None of it was serious enough to call the police about, but collectively it was designed to wear me down. Victoria was playing a psychological warfare game, and she was better at it than I'd expected. But there's what Victoria didn't know about me. I've always been a methodical person. While she was running around playing pranks like some kind of middle school bully, I was documenting everything. I installed discrete security cameras around my property, not the obvious kind that scream surveillance system, but the tiny ones that look like they're part of landscaping. Within a week, I had hours of footage of Victoria and her little helpers creeping around my play scene, the middle of the night, cutting fishing lines, dumping soap in the lake, and generally acting like juvenile delinquents. It was actually pretty pathetic to watch a grown woman reduced to petty vandalism because she couldn't handle being wrong. The breaking point came when Victoria managed to rally 12 residents to sign a petition demanding me removal for community safety. She presented this document to me on a Friday afternoon, clearly expecting me to be intimidated by the show of community opposition. The petition was full of dramatic language about unknown individuals and Threats to our peaceful way of life. What made me chuckle was reading some of the signatures. Half of them were people I'd never even met, and the other half were folks who'd probably sign anything Victoria put in front of them just to get her to leave them alone. Interesting signatures. I told her after giving the petition a thorough read. That's when I decided it was time to make a phone call. I pulled out my cell phone right there in front of Victoria and dialed a number I hadn't used in months. "Hi, this is Jake Miller," I said, making sure she could hear every word. "I need you to prepare the Pine Lake files, all of them." I paused for a moment, listening to the voice on the other end. "These everything we discussed last year. It's time to move forward with a plan." Victoria was trying to pretend she wasn't eavesdropping, but I could see her leaning in to catch what I was saying. When I hung up, she tried to act casual, but I could tell her curiosity was eating her alive. "Making more legal threats?" she asked, trying to sound dismissive, but failing to hide the nervousness in her voice. I just smiled and folded up her petition, tucking it into my jacket pocket. "Just taking care of some business," I replied. "You know how it is sometimes. You have to call in theft professionals to handle complex situations." The look on her face told me she was already imagining all kinds of legal troubles heading her way. But what she couldn't possibly have guessed was that the Pine Lake files weren't about lawsuits or legal battles. They were about something much more fundamental than that. Over the weekend, I spent some time going through those old documents my grandfather had left me, along with some newer paperwork I've been accumulating over the past few years. There were property surveys, purchase agreements, mineral rights documents, and a whole lot of other legal paperwork that painted a very different picture of Pine Lake than what Victoria thought she knew. As I sat there organizing everything into neat piles, I couldn't help but think about how shocked she was going to be when she finally learned that truth. Old Pete stopped by on Sunday evening and found me surrounded by papers. "Looks like you're preparing for something big," he observed. I nodded and kept sorting documents. "You could say that I think it's time." Victoria and the rest of the community got the full picture of what's really going on around here. "What's in those Pine Lake files that has Jake so confident?" Comment below if you think Jake's planning something big. Victoria wasted no time calling an emergency HOA meeting for the following Thursday evening. She sent out notices to every resident around Pine Lake, describing it as a critical community safety meeting to address the ongoing trespasser situation. The way she worded the announcement, "You think I was some kind of dangerous fugitive who'd been terrorizing the neighborhood for months?" Should book. The community center set up chairs for about 60 people and even created an agenda that listed my permanent removal as the main item for discussion. I had to admire her organizational skills, even if her facts were completely wrong. I showed up about 10 minutes after the meeting started, carrying my leather briefcase and wearing the one decent suit I owned. Victoria was already in full presentation mode, standing at the front of the room with a PowerPoint slideshow about community standards and property protection. When I walked in, she stopped mid-sentence and pointed at me like I was some kind of exhibit. "There, he is the person who's been terrorizing our peaceful community." A few people turned to look at me, but most of them seemed more curious than hostile. I nodded politely to everyone and took a seat in the back row, setting my briefcase on the floor beside me. "You have no right to bear," Victoria declared, her voice echoing off the walls of the community center. "This is HOA business, and you're not a member of this association." I stayed quiet and let her continue her presentation, which was actually quite elaborate. She had charts showing property values, photos of my cabin taken from unflattering angles, and even a timeline of what she called escalating antisocial behavior. It was like watching someone build an entire case based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the facts. The more she talked, the more I realized just how much work she'd put into this crusade against me. Several residents raised their hands with questions, most of them pretty reasonably. An older woman asked about the police visit and whether any actual laws had been broken. A middle-aged man wanted to know if the HOA had consulted with a lawyer before taking action. Victoria deflected most of these questions, insisting that the community needed to take a stand before the situation got completely out of control. She was working herself up into quite a frenzy, pacing back and forth at the front of the room like some kind of televised preacher. "We cannot allow outsiders to intimidate legitimate property owners," she declared. That's when I decided it was time to join the conversation. I stood up, slowly picked up my briefcase, and walked toward the front of the room. Victoria immediately started objecting. "Security, someone call security, remove this man from our meeting." But there wasn't any security, and nobody seemed particularly interested in removing me. Old Pete, who was sitting in the third row, actually chuckled and said, "Let the man speak, Victoria. This is America." Last time I checked, several of the residents nodded in agreement, and I could tell that Victoria's aggressive tactics were starting to backfire on her. "Thank you," I said, setting my briefcase on the table next to Victoria's laptop. "I appreciate the opportunity to address some of the concerns that I've been raised, Victoria was practically vibrating with anger, but she couldn't truly stop me. Without looking completely unreasonable, in front of the whole community, I opened my briefcase and pulled out a large folded survey map kind that professional developers use for major projects. Victoria has done a lot of research about property ownership around Pine Lake. I begin unfolding the map across the table, but I think there might be some important information she missed. "Don't listen to him," Victoria shouted. "He's just trying to confuse everyone with legal mumbo-jumbo." But people were already leaning forward in their chairs, trying to get a better look at the map I was spreading out. It was a detailed survey of the entire Pine Lake area with every property clearly marked and color-coded according to ownership. Most of the properties were highlighted in blue, which according to the legend meant they were owned by Miller Holdings LLC. The few properties that weren't blue were marked in red, indicating different ownership entities. "Actually, Victoria, I do have the right to be here," I said calmly, pointing to the community sense location on the map. "You see, I own the land underneath this community center and your house and most of the houses in this room." The silence that followed was so complete, you could have heard a pin drop. Victoria's face went from red to white to a sort-of greenish color I'd never seen on a human being before. "That's impossible," she whispered, but her voice carried in dead quiet room. I reached into my briefcase again and pulled out a stack of property deeds, all properly notarized and recorded with the county. Over the past 8 years, I've been quietly purchasing Pine Lake properties through various limited liability companies. Approximately 80% of the homes around this lake are built on land that I own, with residents holding long-term ground leases. I could see people frantically digging through their purses and wallets looking for their property documents. "These aren't traditional mortgages," I continued. "Most of you signed lease agreements when you bought your homes, probably without realizing what that meant." The room erupted in confused chatter as people started comparing fire paperwork. "My lease agreement says Miller Properties," someone called out from the middle of the room. "Mine too," shouted another voice. "Oh my God, mine says the same thing." Victoria stood there frozen, watching her entire world crumble around her. She'd spent weeks trying to evict someone who actually owned most of the community. She thought she was protecting. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. "Victoria," I said, consulting my map, "your house says on lot 47, according to my records. Your ground lease expires in 14 months. I looked up at her with the same polite smile I've been giving her since day one. "I'll be reviewing all lease renewals very carefully, taking into account each resident's contribution to community harmony and neighborly relations." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and Victoria understood it perfectly. Her expression went blank, and she slowly sank into the nearest chair, still gripping the red clipboard, as if it were the only thing grounding her in the moment. Old Peter started laughing first. A deep belly laugh that filled the room. "Told you she was barking up the wrong tree," he said, wiping tears from his eyes, "but I never imagined it was this big a tree." Other residents started laughing, not maliciously, but with the kind of relief people feel when a tense situation suddenly becomes absurd. Victoria sat there in stunned silence, probably trying to figure out how she'd gotten everything so completely wrong. The woman would been terrorizing me for weeks because she thought I was trespassing on community property. Had just discovered that she was essentially my tenant. I packed up my maps and documents while people continued to process what they juiced. Learned several residents approached me with questions about their lease terms, and I assured them that nothing would change for anyone who'd been acting in good faith. "I'm not interested in disrupting anyone's life," I told them. "I just want to live peacefully on my property without harassment." As I headed for the door, I could hear Victoria behind me still muttering, "Impossible, impossible." Like some kind-off broken record, the meeting broke up quickly after that, with most people heading home to examine their property documents more carefully. How will Victoria react when she realizes she's been attacking her own landlord? Drop a comment about the most satisfying plot twist you've ever seen. The transformation in Victoria after that meeting was something to behold. Within 24 hours, she went from being the self-appointed queen of Pine Lake to a complete social pariah. Word spread fast in a small community like ours, and people who'd been afraid to oppose her suddenly found their courage. Residents who'd been quietly enduring her tyranny for months started sharing their own Victoria horror stories. It turned out she'd been bullying people about everything from lawn care to mailbox clerks, always threatening HOA fines and community action. Now that everyone knew she had no real power, the mood around Lake shifted dramatically. Victoria didn't handle this reversal well at all. She started what I can only describe as a social media meltdown. Posting increasingly frantic messages about local tyrants and threats to evict entire communities. She was spinning theory like I was some kind of evil landlord who tricked innocent families into signing predatory lease agreements. The problem with her narrative was that most of the residents actually have pretty good lease terms. I had structured The deals to be favorable to the tenants because I wanted stable long-term occupancy. But Victoria wasn't interested in facts at this point. She was running on pure desperation and wounded pride. What I didn't know until later was that Victoria's extreme reaction to potentially losing her housing had deep roots. Old Pete filled me in. After running into her former neighbor from Riverside Heights, the community she'd been kicked out of before moving to Pine Lake, apparently Victoria had been evicted from 3 different places as a child when her family couldn't make rent, and she developed this obsessive need to control her living situation. As handled, her aggressive HOA behavior wasn't just about power, it was about never feeling vulnerable again. Unfortunately, her methods for achieving security involved making everyone else feel vulnerable. Instead, she started trying to contact news stations, claiming she had a story about land grabbing and community intimidation. I heard through the grapevine that she'd called at least 6 different local reporters, but none of them were interested in her version of events. Turns out the woman discovers she'd been harassing her own landlord in exactly the David versus Goliath story. She was trying to pitch the reporters, who did respond, ask basic questions about the legality of the lease agreements and the recorded property deeds. And when Victoria could provide any evidence of actual wrongdoing, they moved on to other stories. The stress was clearly getting to her. People reported seeing her at the grocery store muttering to herself and buying nothing but wine and frozen dinners. Her usually perfect appearance started deteriorating. Her hair looked unwashed, her clothes were wrinkled, and she had this wild look in her eyes like someone who hadn't been sleeping. A few of the more compassionate residents actually tried to reach out to her, but she rebuffed every attempt at reconciliation. She seemed to view any gesture of kindness as evidence of a conspiracy against her. That's when she started getting paranoid about my future plans. I was having a casual conversation with old Pete by the dock one afternoon, talking about some infrastructure I've been considering for the community. The utility situation should stabilize soon. I mentioned referring to some upgrades I've been planning for the electrical grid. I've been working on some infrastructure that should benefit everyone around here. It was just normal landlord stuff, making sure the community remained attractive and functional for all the residents. But Victoria, who'd apparently been lurking behind some trees like some kind of deranged spy, overheard part of our conversation and immediately jumped to the worst possible conclusion. She came charging out of the bushes like something out of a horror movie, her hair full of leaves and her eyes blazing with paranoid fury. "What utilities?" she demanded. "What's he planning? Are you going to cut off our power or water? Is this how you're going to force us all out?" Old Pete and I just stared at her, not sure whether to law or call for professional help. "Victoria," I said as gently as I could, "I'm talking about improvements, not cutting anything off. I want to make the community better, not worse." But she was beyond rational conversation at this point. She'd worked herself up into such a state that everything I said sounded like a threat to her. "I know what you're doing," she screamed. "You think you can just buy up everything and push out the people who built this community? Well, I won't let you destroy everything we've worked for." She was crying and yelling at the same time, which was both pathetic and genuinely concerning. The final confrontation came on a Sunday evening when I was enjoying a quiet sunset by the water. Victoria showed up at my dock completely drunk and disheveled, swaying on her feet and slurring her words. "You think you've won, don't you?" she said, pointing an unsteady finger at me. "You think you can just steal people's home sand? Nobody will fight back." I stood up slowly, concerned she might fall into the lake. In her condition, Victoria, "Y'all should go home and get some rest. We can talk about this when you're feeling better." But she wasn't interested in reasonable conversation. "I'll burn this whole place down before I let you destroy our community," she shouted loud enough for half the lake to hear. "People like you think you can just waltz in and take over everything, but I'll stop you. We'll find a way to stop you." She was becoming increasingly agitated, and I was starting to worry she might actually be dangerous. Old Pete appeared at my side. He'd heard the commotion from his house and come to investigate. Victoria essayed in his calm, grandfatherly voice, "You need to go home now. You're scaring people." She looked back and forth between Pete and me, tears streaming down her face, and for a moment I actually felt sorry for her. This was a woman who built her entire identity around being in control, and now that identity was crumbling. "You don't understand," she whispered. "None of you understand. This is all I have. This is all I've ever had." Then she turned and stumbled back toward her house, muttering threats and curses under her breath. Pete shook his head as we watched her go. "She's dangerous now," he said quietly. "Desperate people do desperate things." I nodded, already thinking about the security precautions I might need to take. "What desperate move will Victoria make when she has nothing left to lose? Let me know if you think Victoria is about to do something truly crazy." You should have seen it coming. All the signs were there. Victoria's increasingly erratic behavior, her threats about burning the place down, her complete psychological breakdown after losing her perceived position of power, but even knowing she was unstable, I wasn't prepared for what happened at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. I was sound asleep in my cabin when the security system I'd installed went off. Like a fire alarm, motion sensors, perimeter alerts, that whole 9 yards. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the camera feeds. And there she was, Victoria, creeping around my property in the dark. Like some kind of deranged burglar, she was carrying something in her hands. And it took me a moment to realize what it was. A gas can and what looked like a lighter. My blood ran cold when I saw her heading straight for my deck, where I'd left my grandfather's golden bamboo fishing rod propped against the railing. That rod wasn't just fishing equipment, it was one of the few tangible connections I had left to my grandfather, who taught me everything it knew about patience, respect, and handling difficult people. The thought of Victoria destroying it in some twisted act of revenge made me angrier than I had been in years. I hit the emergency contact on my phone, a direct line to the county sheriff's dispatch that I had set up when I first installed the security system. "This is Jake Miller at Pine Lake," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I have an intruder on my property attempting to commit arson. I need police immediately." While I was talking to the dispatcher through the live security feed, I saw Victoria behaving suspiciously near my dock, holding what looked like a fuel container and something in her hand that resembled a lighter. My heart sank. She appeared to be preparing to do something reckless. The woman had completely lost her mind. The police response time was incredible, less than 4 minutes from my call to the sound of sirens coming down the lake road. Victoria heard them coming and tried to run, but she was drunk and panicked and ended up tripping over her own feet. The officers arrived just in time and found her near the dock, visibly agitated and smelling strongly of gasoline. She was holding the same object I'd seen on camera. Thankfully, no damage had occurred yet, and they intervened before anything worse could happen. Even in her deranged state, she'd been specifically targeting the thing she knew would hurt me most, the stealing everyone's homes. She screamed as they cuffed her. "Someone has to stop him. He's destroying our community." The responding officer, someone I recognized from the first incident, gave her a firm but calm look. "Ma'am," he said, "we've documented enough evidence to take this matter very seriously." He explained her rights in a professional tone, and she was escorted off the property for further questioning regarding the incident. They had to physically carry her to the patrol car because she kept trying to break free and run back toward my cabin. Even as they drove away, I could hear her shouting about conspiracies and community protection. The trial took place about 6 weeks later. At Westgate, a spectacle. Victoria's lawyer, a public defender who looked like he'd drawn the short straw, tried to argue temporary insanity due to the stress of facing potential eviction. He painted a picture of a woman driven to desperate measures by an intimidating landlord who was threatening her housing security. Wasn't a terrible strategy, actually, and it might have worked if the prosecution hadn't had such overwhelming evidence of premeditation and clear intent to commit arson. Victoria took the stand in her own defense, which turned out to be a huge mistake. She spent 2 hours ranting about community values and property rights, claiming she was just trying to protect the neighborhood from a predator. The more she talked, the more unhinged she sounded. At one point, she actually told the jury that burning my property was justified because I was an outsider who didn't understand the community's needs. The prosecutor didn't even need to cross-examine her. She basically convicted herself with her own testimony. But here's where things got real interesting. Just when I thought the case was over, my lawyer stood up and asked permission to present one final piece of evidence. "Your Honor," he said, "there's something the defendant doesn't know that I believe is relevant to this case." He produced a stack of documents from his briefcase, all properly notarized and certified. Miller doesn't just own most of the land around Pine Lake, he also owns Pine Lake Utilities, the company that provides electricity, water, and internet to every home in this community, including the defendant's residence. The courtroom went dead silent. Victoria's face went through about 6 different expressions in the span of 2 seconds: confusion, disbelief, horror, and finally a kind of desperate fury. "That's impossible," she shouted, but her voice cracked on the words. My lawyer continued calmly, "For the past 3 years, Mr. Miller has been subsidizing utility costs for all Pine Lake residents, keeping their bills 40% below market rate. The defendant has been attempting to drive away her own benefactor." That's when Victoria completely lost it, jumped up from the defendant's table and started screaming at the top of her lungs, "No, this can't be happening. Heck, can own everything. It's not fair. It's not legal." The bailiff had to restrain her while the judge pounded his gavel for order, but Victoria wasn't done. "He's lying. They're all lying. This is a conspiracy to steal our home security." Had to physically remove her from the courtroom while she continued shrieking about conspiracies and cover-ups. The jury deliberated for exactly 23 minutes before returning with a guilty verdict on all charges. The judge sentenced Victoria to 18 months of probation, to 100 hours of community service, specifically focused on cleaning the Pine Lake shoreline, a restraining order requiring her to stay at least 500 feet from my property, and mandatory anger management counseling. He also ordered her to pay restitution for the property damage and the cost of the emergency response before the judge dismissed the court case. If I wanted to make a victim impact statement, I stood up and looked directly at Victoria, who was staring at me with pure hatred in her eyes. "Your Honor," I said, "despite everything that's happened, I won't be pressing for utility disconnection or lease termination. Everyone deserves basic services and housing security, regardless of their behavior toward me. I hope Ms. Victoria can use this experience to learn something about community cooperation and mutual respect." Victoria's lawyer looked relieved. He'd probably been expecting me to demand the harshest possible punishment, but Victoria herself looked like I'd just slapped her across the face. I think she was so invested in seeing me as a villain that my gesture of mercy actually made her angrier than any punishment would have. As they let her out of the courtroom, she turned back one last time and shouted, "This isn't over. People like you don't get to win." But it was over, and we all knew it walking out of that courthouse. I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: genuine peace. Victoria would be cleaning shoreline where I fished every weekend, seeing me living quietly on my property, being reminded every week that their crusade had been based on complete ignorance. It was poetic justice in that truest sense, and probably the best possible outcome for everyone involved. Could this humbling experience finally to Victoria a lesson about respect? Comment your prediction for how the story ends. The Saturday morning cleanup crew was quite a sight to behold. There was Victoria dressed in an orange safety vest and carrying a trash bag, slowly working her way along the Pine Lake shoreline under the supervision of a county community service coordinator. The first time I saw her out there, I was sitting on my dock with my grandfather's golden bamboo fishing rod, the same rod she tried to burn, enjoying my morning coffee when she noticed me. Watching her face turned red with embarrassment and danger, but she couldn't do anything about it. She had to keep picking up litter while I sat there fishing in perfect peace. I made it a point to wave politely every time I saw her during those community service hours, not in a mocking way, but with genuine friendliness. The same way I'd greet any neighbor doing work around the community. It drove her absolutely crazy. She'd glance over occasionally with a cold expression, but chose to stay silent, likely aware that any outburst could complicate things further. The restraining order meant she had to stay 500 feet away from my property so she could see me, but couldn't approach. It was like watching someone trying to argue with a person on the other side of a soundproof window. The transformation in the community atmosphere was remarkable. Without Victoria's constant drama and manufactured crisis, Pine Lake became the peaceful place it was meant to be. Residents started talking to each other again instead of walking around in fear of HOA violations. People began taking evening walks around the lake. Kids started fishing from the community dock, and folks actually seemed to enjoy living there. Several neighbors made a point of stopping by my place to apologize for not speaking up earlier when Victoria was harassing me. We knew she was wrong, one woman told me, but she made it so unpleasant to disagree with her that it was easier to just keep quiet. Old Pete became my regular fishing companion during those Saturday morning community service sessions. He'd bring his own chair and a thermos of coffee, and we'd sit there watching Victoria work while discussing everything from baseball to local politics. Best entertainment I've had in years. He'd chuckle as Victoria struggled to pick up trash along the rocky shoreline. "You know, I've seen a lot of bullies in my time, but I've never seen one get their comeuppance quite so thoroughly." Pete had a way of finding humor in everything, and his presence made the whole situation feel less awkward. The business side of things worked out better than I'd expected. To once residents understood that I was a reasonable landlord who actually cared about maintaining the community. Several people approached me about home improvements and property upgrades. I discovered that my lease terms were far more generous than most of them had realized. I'd structured everything to favor long-term tenancy and community stability. Property values around Pine Lake increased by about 15% over the next year, partly due to the peaceful atmosphere, and partly because word got out about my infrastructure investments. Victoria herself underwent a gradual change during those months of community service. The manual labor seemed to have a therapeutic effect on her, though she probably died before admitting it. By month 3 of her sentence, she'd stopped glaring at me quite so intensely. By month 6, she was actually doing a decent job with the cleanup work, taking pride in keeping the shoreline looking nice. She never apologized or acknowledged that she'd been wrong, but the manic intensity that had defined her behavior during our conflict seemed to drain away as the weeks passed. The anger management counseling apparently helped too. I ran into her counselor at the grocery store one day, and while Heck couldn't discuss specifics due to confidentiality, he did mention that Victoria was making significant progress in understanding how her childhood experiences with housing insecurity had influenced her adult behavior. It made sense. When I thought about it, her desperate need to control everything around her property had been driven by a deep fear of losing her home, the same fear that had haunted her since childhood. As Victoria's community service sentence neared its end, I found myself in an unexpected position. Several residents had approached me about the possibility of extending the shoreline cleanup program as a regular community activity. They'd seen how much better the lake looked after months of Victoria's mandatory labor, and they wanted to maintain that standard. I agreed to sponsor a voluntary monthly cleanup day, with a small stipend for participants and a community barbecue afterward. To everyone's surprise, Victoria was one of the first to volunteer. When her court-ordered service ended the finality of her sentence, I did something that surprised even myself. As Victoria was finishing up her last bag of trash, I walked over to the 500 feet boundary line and called out to her. Victoria, I said, raising my voice so she could hear me clearly, I wanted to thank you for keeping our community looking so beautiful these past months. The lake has never looked better. She stared at me for a long moment, probably trying to figure out if I was mocking her, but I meant it sincerely. She really had done good work, even if it had taken a court order to get her started that evening. As the sun was setting over Pine Lake, I sat in my usual spot with my grandfather's golden bamboo rod, thinking about everything that had happened. The water was like glass, reflecting the orange and pink sky, and the only sounds were the gentle lapping of water against the dock and the occasional call of a lawn. This was exactly what my grandfather had envisioned when he bought this property back in 1987, a place where someone could find peace and quiet away from the noisy and conflict of the world. Grandpa always said, the best fishing requires patience. Sometimes you wait hours for the right bite, sometimes you wait years, but when someone tries to steal your fishing spot, well, that's when you show them who really owns the lake. I cast my line into the still water and settled back to wait for whatever might come next, knowing that sometimes the best victories are the ones where everybody learns something valuable in the end. Share this story if you believe karma always comes around, and tell me in the comments what's the most satisfying justice you've ever witnessed.